In the age of the internet, we buy and sell across the globe at the push of a button. The great technological advances which gave birth to the World Wide Web are constantly driven forward by the needs of commerce and trade. But this is nothing new. Archaeologists are still uncovering the secrets of international trade between the ancient empires of our past. Even in ancient societies, it seems that trade was the driving force behind change and progress. The world in which we live has been tailored to facilitate trade and commerce, but sometimes that trade is less than desirable. Drugs have become the scourge of the modern world. The terrible cycle of addiction, dependency, and despair is depressingly familiar in every society. Trafficking in drugs is a global offense, but new findings point to the fact that drugs like opium may have been traded since the very earliest of times. There is now clear evidence to suggest that in ancient societies there was already a highly developed trade in cocaine and heroin. This is just one of the many secrets of trade between ancient empires which are now being discovered. In the next hour, we'll explore the new breakthroughs in archaeology which are reshaping our view of ancient merchants. We explore the trade in obsidian knives and uncover the amazing story of the shipwreck at Uluburun. We investigate astounding new evidence of an ancient trade across continents. We also look into the beginnings of trade in silk, the most luxurious of materials, and how it became a vital link between East and West in ancient times.
There's no doubt that trade and exchange are not only one of the great measures of the development of society, but also clearly one of the great driving forces.
I think the reason trade's been so important for the growth of civilization is because when people trade, they meet. So people would see new things, talk about new things, exchange news, and obviously exchange wives and husbands and so on as well.
And that has meant that they have developed large groups of people working with each other. But they went on to make artifacts in very complicated ways, which lead us to understand very directly how they ran a bureaucracy.
So every reason to think of trade as being one of the essential requirements for any kind of expanded urban civilization, because you have to distribute it. The form that that trade takes, of course, may vary.
Archaeologists of the Victorian era assume that ancient trade was made up largely of necessities, bulky items such as grain and livestock. They thought that ancient man would have been too preoccupied with survival to trade in luxury goods. But recent evidence of widespread trading dating back as far as the Stone Age has turned these ideas on their head.
Just about the earliest evidence we have for trade is the black stone called obsidian, which is volcanic product, volcanic glass, and it was used in the same way as flint.
And it's got such a sharp edge that it's actually literally sharper than steel, and is still used today by heart surgeons when they want to avoid having a scar tissue as a result of the operations.
And these sorts of blades are found all over the Middle East, dating back to 5,000 or 6,000 BC, and yet they only appear, naturally they occur in just a few locations.
Archaeologists don't always consider obsidian knives as luxuries. This is because of their obvious functions as tools or weapons. But in modern terms, they certainly represented a top-of-the-range model. Stone Age man would have recognized this just as much as we do. These knives were highly durable, relatively lightweight, and almost certainly commanded a good price. It's intriguing to speculate just how much prestige a noble would gain from owning one. Could this have been the start of commercialism in the ancient world? As the trade in luxury goods grew, obsidian became increasingly sought after. Traders would cross great distances to sell knives made of this volcanic glass. One of the very first settlements to cater to this new economy was the town of Çatalhöyük in ancient Anatolia.
Çatalhöyük, basically, a lot of people would surmise, actually built up its size and its reputation as a centre by being a sort of middleman between the volcanic regions where the stone was quarried and distributing it to other parts of the country.
Çatalhöyük and its peoples thrived for over 1,500 years. Archaeological evidence shows us that at its height more than 7,000 people were living and trading there. Wherever this precious black glass was found, trade and population flourished. One of these sites was the Greek island of Milos, but the ancient obsidian trade here had other secrets to give up.
Because it's found in only a limited number of places, and because by analysis, by scientific analysis, you can confirm that if you found this bit of obsidian on the Greek mainland, you can confirm this piece had to have come from Milos, so you can establish the trading pattern.
There's an uncanny resemblance between this old world trade and its new world counterpart. In a region of what is now southern Mexico lived the ancient Olmec peoples. They also worked with obsidian, but there was none to be mined where they lived. It could be found in Guatemala, 250 miles to the south, in the Valley of Mexico, 250 miles to the north, and from the Pachuca region, 300 miles to the north. To do so required endurance testing marches through dense jungle. It was a price worth paying. In time, the Olmecs gave way to the people of the city of Teotihuacan, near the site of modern Mexico City. It was from this city of pyramids that trade in obsidian tools took off in the ancient societies of Central America. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, just like modern New York. It housed many specialist craft workshops. The making and marketing of obsidian tools became as basic to their economy as the steel industry has been to modern nations. Such was the demand for these goods that the city of Teotihuacan imported obsidian from as far as 500 miles away. The leaders of the city consolidated their power by controlling the trade. Obsidian tools were traded for luxury items such as cacao, the source of chocolate. In ancient times, an important trade in obsidian tools grew up on both sides of the Atlantic. The trader's goal was to supply a strong demand for high-quality goods that could not be met locally. The ancients took long, perilous journeys to fill this gap in the market. The first merchants must have needed grit and determination as well as good sense to succeed. They also needed new forms of transport.
Development of trade has always been a great stimulus to travel, obviously, and so I suppose it could be argued that ship design has always benefited, because ship design improves, no doubt, through increasingly long voyages, and those increasingly long voyages have generally been motivated by trading objectives. I think in most early civilizations there aren't really very many good reasons to go on long sea voyages other than to get the stuff you need, the exotic stuff which you're going to get from somewhere else.
The secrets of ancient sea traders have recently been uncovered. The discovery of a shipwreck at Uluburun, off the coast of southern Turkey, has revolutionized thinking about Bronze Age trade. The ship sank about 1300 BC, making it the oldest excavated shipwreck. It lies nearly 200 feet below the surface of the sea. The project team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology have made 22,500 dives to it in 10 years of research. What their divers have brought up from the wreck has stunned scholars worldwide. The Uluburun wreck has proved itself one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time. Tons of artifacts have been recovered. The exquisite beauty and craftsmanship of some of the items have few equals, if any. The wreck truly merits the description of a treasure ship. The variety and richness of the materials recovered simply amazed the project team. On board were ebony logs from tropical Africa, amber beads from northern Europe, a bronze sword from Italy, a seal carved in Mesopotamia, pottery from Cyprus, ceramics from Greece, tin either from Britain or Afghanistan, weapons from Palestine, along with Canaanite jewelry. All were found in excellent condition. Also on board were 175 ingots of glass, some cobalt blue, some turquoise, along with one unique example, colored lavender. There were 4 faience drinking cups, one in the shape of a woman. Ostrich eggshells were found, which were probably used as receptacles. The shells of tortoises, destined to become sounding boxes for lutes. 2 duck-shaped ivory cosmetic containers were brought to the surface. Even an ivory trumpet was discovered. The list of luxuries seems almost endless. But this was not all. Folding wooden writing tables were found. These tables had their insides covered in beeswax. Writing or accounts were then scored into the soft material. It's been said that had the beeswax not been washed away by the sea, the wreck would have given us the world's oldest books. Most interestingly, the ship was carrying 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin, the constituents of bronze. These were in the form of ingots, solid metal bars. This was enough bronze to equip an ancient army with weaponry. There were also animal-shaped stone weights. The weights are of particular interest as they were used by merchants to assess the value of traded ingots. The discovery of the ingots and the weights points distinctly to the likelihood of the ship being part of a complex commercial operation. The extraordinary variety of items on the ship leads us away from the idea that it was loaded full at one port only. It stored in its hold goods from 3 continents. Some of these goods had travelled great distances, even to get to the port where they were taken aboard. It seems likely that the ship plied a circular route around the Mediterranean. For this reason, it's difficult to place the ownership of the craft. The personal effects of the crew suggest they came from across the region. But new evidence has discovered that it could have carried a more controversial cargo. The great ports of the Egyptian pharaohs would have certainly been a port of call for seafaring traders. There's plenty of evidence for their extravagant tastes in fine garments and beautifully crafted utensils of all kinds. But recent research into their use of drugs has thrown the most basic assumptions about early trade into doubt.
People often think that drugs are, a kind of modern thing almost, but certainly we know that people were trading in drugs for thousands of years. And one very clear example of this was that Cyprus was sending a lot of opium to Egypt during the time of Tutankhamun.
The story of the ancient Egyptian drug trade begins in Cyprus. It seems that a major cultivation took place on the island of a highly valued flower. It was a plant known for both its sacred and its medicinal uses. It was the opium poppy. Opium was reputed to cure or alleviate a multitude of ailments. It was used as a sedative painkiller for wounds and abscesses. It was also considered a powerful aphrodisiac. This idea undoubtedly increased its value considerably. But opium had religious uses as well. By drinking the juice of the poppy, a devotee could induce a trance in which they might encounter the gods. The Cypriot traders in opium had the advantage that their product was lightweight. But they had a difficulty. They traded across large distances, which meant that language barriers had to be overcome. Their solution was ingenious and elegant.
This was very much a good example of international trade and the logistics of how international trade worked, because obviously a lot of the people that were trading didn't understand each other's languages. And one of the best ways of, as it were, advertising the product that was being imported was the shape of the vessels in which it was carried. And what they did was they made these special juglets that were actually shaped like an opium poppy, so that people could see what was inside it.
These vessels, known as base ring juglets, have been found in tombs all across the Near East. Scientific tests on the residue found inside juglets discovered in Egypt have shown that they once contained opium. If further evidence were needed that the pharaohs used opium, the tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose III supplies it. Here an opium poppy capsule was found inside his last resting place. These revelations may seem extraordinary enough, but new findings from Germany are causing a seismic shift in the theories of early drug trade. Dr. Svetlana Balabanova, one of the world's most highly respected toxicologists, tested one of the Egyptian mummies at the Munich Museum for traces of drugs. This was the 3,000-year-old mummy Henut Tui, the Lady of the Two Lands. Balabanova examined hair and tissue using the same methods used in criminal courts. When the test results came back, Dr. Balabanova was so astonished she was sure they must be in error. The lady Henut Tui had tested positive for nicotine and cocaine. Under current thinking, this result was simply impossible. Tobacco and cocaine are New World drugs. History insists that Sir Walter Raleigh introduced smoking tobacco into Europe in the 16th century. Cocaine is not thought to have crossed the Atlantic Ocean until the Victorian period. Certainly any such cargo to Europe would be unimaginable to historians before Columbus and the discovery of the Americas. The doctor understandably thought her results incorrect. She sent samples from the mummy to 3 independent labs to do their own objective tests. She was sure they would fail to corroborate her findings. Surely some fault in her method would be detected. The independent laboratories confirmed her original findings. Cocaine and nicotine were present in the tissue of the mummy. The mystery had suddenly deepened dramatically. Dr. Balabanova set about testing other mummies from the Egyptian Empire. She found that about 1/3 tested positive for nicotine and cocaine. She was stunned. She wrote a paper on her findings. Its publication proved so controversial that she received scathing letters from other practitioners in her field. They feared she would bring their branch of science into disrepute. Little further research has been done since her earth-shattering findings were made public. Few scientists are willing to risk their reputations by tackling head-on the astonishing implications of her discovery. Did the ancient world partake in a transatlantic drug trade? It's not surprising that few are willing to concede the possibility. And yet, the tests done on the Munich mummies are generally considered watertight. The questions raised by the doctor's work hang tantalizingly in the air. The shipwreck at Uluburun has uncovered a great deal of information regarding early trade in 1300 BC. But no evidence was discovered that can point to the existence of a currency being used. Our ancestors seem to have yet to develop a standardized system of coinage and relied instead on the barter system.
Barter trade was meant bringing a lot of sometimes very bulky goods with you and swapping them on the spot for other things you wanted. And one of the reasons why barter can actually be preferred to cash exchange is because if you have very big transportation costs, if the distances are big, then it makes sense to take with you the things that your customers will want. So you can on the spot swap something you've got, like animals, for something you want, like clothes or cloth.
The barter system helped in overcoming language barriers when trading, and is still used by many salesmen throughout the world. Of course, today we're more used to credit cards and cash, But once again it seems that trading with ancient money was far more widespread than generally thought.
In China, for example, cowrie shells were used as a form of currency very early, and they seem to have been traded from a faraway location. The Maldives, they think, was a location for cowrie shells that found their way to China. Because of their scarcity, and you couldn't reproduce or forge them, they formed as currency too.
The old theory about coinage was that it was invented by the Greeks in the 7th century BC. People believed that it spread northwards and was taken all over Europe by the conquering Romans. Once again, recent thinking has its own ideas. Excavations in India revealed coins minted as far back as the earliest Greek coins. The gold coins of the Kushana and the Gupta dynasties are considered to be among the finest of the ancient world. Bronze coins started to appear in China at about the same time. Some from central China were shaped like knives. Others from the Shandong Peninsula in the east were shaped like today's coins. They were cast rather than struck, and each carried an inscription with the name of the state and city that produced it. These coins needed to be large to contain this writing. Later Chinese coins were circular, usually with a square hole in the middle for stringing them on a cord.
This sort of money, if you like, solved some of the problems of barter. Barter trade was meant bringing a lot of sometimes very bulky goods with you and swapping them on the spot for other things you wanted. These sorts of currencies facilitated exchange because you could carry them rather easily. You didn't have to move around with all the products that you'd use if you were going to barter. And so we can see very early civilizations as beginning to create the structure, the framework for market economies as we understand them.
It's now thought that the world's earliest coinage came from Lydia, which is today part of Turkey. Lydia was rich in gold and also in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Lydian kings used this to make coins, and the coinage was well known by the time of King Croesus in the mid-6th century BC. The Lydian capital, Sardis, was in contact with Greek city-states and merchants. It now seems likely that the Greeks got the idea of coinage from central Turkey.
The development of early currencies undoubtedly facilitated trade in that period. Minting precious metals into coins that bore the mark of the political authority that issued them, of course, was a very important step in generating a much more commoditized form of trade, because it allowed a kind of more abstract measurement of value, and from then on, gold and silver, precious metals, became the essential marks of value for much of Europe.
The firm establishing of trade produced stability and wealth, but it was also the bringer of change. Ancient peoples did reach out to discover each other because they wanted to exchange what they produced for what they did not have. Very often, what they did not have were luxury goods. As the objects found at the Uluburun shipwreck have shown, the trade in luxury goods became a widespread and lucrative business.
Luxuries and trade in luxuries seems to have happened very early, and there are some very practical reasons for that. Moving around items that aren't very heavy and not very bulky, but are very valuable, is obviously the sort of trade that can be more easily undertaken over large distances.
The highly profitable trade in luxuries was a truly international business. New merchants dealt not in perishable goods, but in those items that were the most beautiful, the most exotic, the most exquisite and rare. Thankfully for us, they also dealt in artifacts that have survived the passing years. Without these, we'd know far less about the remarkable and extensive trade routes that supplied the ancient world.
It tends to bring different cultures together. It's a kind of international language, I suppose, and people simply like to see things they haven't seen before. So it's a sort of insatiable cycle of it's demanding constantly new things, in the same way people are always wanting to go to new exotic places or new restaurants or whatever. People are always looking for something different.
And so you could see that these are one of the ways in which this other technology, this technology of social control, a political technology, if you like, began to be developed, because they played a role in showing, in marking out the elite from the rest.
The elite classes of ancient civilization soon found new ways of distinguishing themselves from others in society. They gathered finely crafted goods which adorned their bodies and homes. They sought out items that would attract the admiration of their peers.
In some societies, the rulers maintained a large part of their prestige and esteem by controlling the trade in prestige goods coming in from outside, and they could then bestow these on their retinue, who would therefore be of very high prestige. So they were able to enhance their power by controlling the trade, particularly in valuables and high prestige goods.
And often they came from far away, so they also spoke about and symbolised the way in which locally important people were in some kind of distant diplomatic or some other sort of political relationship with distant, powerful figures.
The story of the Silk Road is one of transcontinental trade in the ancient world. It's also fascinating to realize that it was China that first sent explorers west to discover new cultures and to trade. In the past, historians thought that the great civilization of China developed with little or no contact with Western cultures. Between China and India lies the virtually impassable barrier of the Himalayan mountains. Further north lies the ferociously hostile environment of the desert of Taklamakan. The temperature in this desert can reach over 50 degrees Celsius. So arid is it, a local people named it the Land of Death. The Taklamakan is flanked by high mountains both to the north and to the south. Even so, ancient traders found a way through. Along its southern and northern fringes, there are a series of oases. These oases were the key to one of the most famed of all ancient trade routes, the Silk Road.
For centuries before the conquest of the Arabs in 751, this was the basic link between East and West, and traders of every nationality from central Iran moved eastwards primarily to get hold of silk, but also other goods. And the Chinese were interested in getting people, musicians, dancing girls, and certain kinds of spices by this route.
This route made famous the names of Tashkent and Samarkand. The route was never a single road, but several pathways that changed over time to accommodate new political boundaries or to avoid bandits. Contrary to popular myth, it was not Marco Polo who first used the Silk Road to discover China. In fact, it was China that, long before him, first sent emissaries to the West. The birth of the route was the product of difficult times. During the Han Dynasty, the Chinese were under attack from the Xiongnu people. Emperor Wudi decided to send Zhuang Can west to try to gain an alliance against the Xiongnu. On his dangerous journey, Zhuang Can was captured and thrown into jail. He never made the alliance he was sent for, but eventually he returned home with something far more valuable. He'd seen marvelous horses that were larger than those available in China at the time.
Horses do not breed well in China. It's too wet and too hot. But to fight the nomads on horseback, they needed horses. So for centuries, they would trade with the nomads with bales of silk. These bales of silk made their way westwards and became what we know as the Silk Route trade.
It didn't take the Chinese long to realize that they had a wonderful product to trade. Silk became hugely valued, especially as its only source was China. The Chinese had perfected its production several millennia ago.
The manufacture of silk is very sophisticated in its way. It involves taking a cocoon and unravelling the silk so that it can be used as an incredibly fine material for making cloth.
It has, like all Chinese crafts, to be done on an enormous scale. You have to think of millions of worms being turned into silk cloth. Only the Chinese did this, and of course this beautiful cloth had a sheen and would take lovely coloured dyes, and these colours made silk even more alluring.
And of course silk was a very highly prized and valuable commodity for centuries, for millennia. And we can see that silk as a luxury good was traded a very long way into the steppe lands of Eurasia, and various different traders and merchants would pass on this silk till it arrived in Rome.
In the West, in time, the Roman Empire emerged as the dominant power. The Romans first encountered Chinese silk on campaign against the Parthians. Understandably, they were deeply impressed by the beauty and texture of the material. Silk soon became fashionable in Rome. The Parthians quickly realized there was a lucrative trade to be had in bringing the silk west.
Trade by way of middlemen through the Parthian and Persian empires, who straddled the trade routes, was very ancient and was continuing, for example, throughout the time of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China. These two great states never exchanged diplomatic embassies or made any formal political contact, but they did exchange enormous amounts of silk and other luxury goods, of gold and silver coinage, which flowed via the Persian civilization in the middle.
The Romans knew silk was not made by the Parthians. It wasn't long before they sent their own agents east to find the source of silk. The Romans found that the Chinese would not easily part with the secret of silk.
The Silk Route, which took silk from China to the West, was economically very important to the Chinese state. And because they had the monopoly on silk, they very jealously guarded it. So, for example, it's said that there was a death penalty for anybody who smuggled the silkworm out of China.
I mean, one of the things about trade, obviously, is that you don't want other potential rivals to know your sources, if possible. You want to keep it secret where it's coming from and how it's made and all these kinds of things. And of course, you can see it today. I mean, we have all kinds of corporate espionage now, which is really just an elaboration of what's been going on throughout history.
Despite the intentions of the West, the secret of silk remained in Chinese hands for centuries.
In the 6th century, about 550 AD, the Byzantine emperor managed to get his hands on some silkworms that were allegedly smuggled out of China by some monks who had put them in hollow staffs.
And eventually in the Roman West, or the Byzantine West, silk industries were established, and silk was woven in Western Europe at Lyon, but never ever was it made on the scale that is made in China.
As the demand for luxuries grew, so too did the particular wants of the buyer. The consumer was born. As trade routes developed, gold, ivory, gems and glass headed east to be traded for silk, furs, ceramics, lacquer and iron. Where gold was the most highly valued commodity in the West, in the East, jade was considered far more precious. It would be intriguing to know at what rate Western gold was exchanged for Eastern jade.
Jade doesn't come all over China. It's found in two areas in what we would call the Neolithic period, that is pre the use of metal. It occurs around Shanghai and in the far north, north of Peking. And that is significant because it means that Chinese don't get into gold. That whereas our cultures are based on gold and light, we have huge numbers of metaphors about the role of spirituality, which is related metaphorically to gold and light. In China that is missing because they didn't get into gold, they got into jade.
Interestingly, China was not the only civilization that valued jade more highly than gold. When the Spaniards conquered the Aztec Empire, their lust for gold was insatiable. This led many scholars to assume that it was the most highly prized material in ancient Central America. The Aztecs had many gold objects which were melted down by the Spanish conquistadors, but many jade objects survived. Jade was also more highly valued than gold by the more ancient civilizations of Mexico, which the Aztecs had brutally suppressed. In the Olmec era, which lasted from about 1450 BC to 100 BC, many remarkable and very lifelike figures were made of serpentine and jade. Most Olmec objects are made from blue-green jade, but a few are of the transparent dark green jade, which is so highly prized in China. For the Olmecs, jade was not just a precious stone, but also a symbol for the heart of the earth. Their cult of Earth God led them to bury many jade objects as soon as they were made, which is why so many have been so well preserved. Other cultures in Central America used jade for axes, chisels and weapons, but the Olmecs seem to have used their jade mainly for objects of art and devotion. These were widely traded around the large area that is now Mexico. The two main thrusts of Olmec expansion across Mexico to the northwest and towards Guatemala to the southeast can be explained by the need to guarantee their supplies of jade. It's possible that the continued fondness of native peoples for jade, serpentine and turquoise may have reduced their opposition to the Spanish removal of gold. Over and again, new discoveries have pushed back the date of the start of trading. Furthermore, trade routes have been shown to be more extensive and complex than previously thought. As the voyage of discovery continues, more and more information about our past is being uncovered, but scholars know that each new find raises as many questions as it answers. The search for the marvelous secrets of ancient civilizations continues.